Continuing with the cranial bones, we have the sphenoid bone, which is a bat-shaped bone. Kind of looks like the symbol for Batman. And as I mentioned previously, it's the keystone bone because it articulates with all other cranial bones. It has within it sphenoidal sinuses. The body also includes what's called a sella turcica, which literally means Turkish saddle. And it kind of looks like the saddle that you would put on top of a horse. And this is a very important part because it includes the hypophyseal fossa. Remember that a fossa is a depression, and the hypophysis is the kind of the microscopic name for the pituitary. So that's where the pituitary gland sits. Our last cranial bone is the ethmoid bone, the deepest skull bone, and it's the top of it is formed by cribriform plates that also form the roof of the nasal cavity. There's a triangular process called the crista galli, which attaches to the brain's dura mater. The brain's dura mater, while we haven't learned about it yet, is the brain's outermost meninge. And singular, it's called a meninx. There's also what are called perpendicular plates that are flanked by lateral masses, and there's ethmoidal air cells. So there's another um, cavity or sinus in here as well. And then there's the superior and middle nasal conchae. So we see those images on our diagram here. So I want to highlight first of all the cranial bones. So we can see the forehead, the frontal bone. Posterior to that would be two parietal bones. Then there is the sphenoid bone. That's the so-called keystone bone. There's the two temporal bones, one on either side. The ethmoid bone, which is also shown over here. And then in the back, we have the occipital bone and a view of the parietal bone and part of the temporal bone. So those are the cranial bones. When we look at an inferior bone, or I'm sorry, an inferior view, we're going to see some other structures. But in the meantime, I'll just go ahead and highlight some of the other facial bones, like the nasal bone, lacrimal bone, zygomatic bone, maxilla, mandible, inferior nasal concha, and vomer. And then there will be some specific parts of those bones that you'll need to know. For lab, you'll have to identify them. For lecture, I may say, for example, what bone is the mastoid process located on? So there won't be diagrams on the lecture exam, but there may very well be questions like I just posed to you. When we look at the inferior view of the skull, so in lab, turn the model upside down, or if you're in an online lab, there's ways to also view this online. So we can first point out some of the cranial bones, like the occipital bone, the sphenoid bone, parietal bone, temporal bone, and that is all of the cranial bones that we can see from the inferior. For the maxilla bones, we can see, or for the facial bones, we can see the maxilla, the palatine bone, zygomatic bone, vomer, and then the maxilla on this side. And then some of these structures you'll be responsible for. Again, you need to ask your lab instructor, but usually we don't ask the foramen ovale, foramen spinosum, foramen lacerum, carotid canal. But some of the important ones that are usually important are external acoustic meatus, occipital condyle, foramen magnum, mandibular fossa, So there'll be a few like that. And again, if I don't mention them or they're not in the study guide, they won't be in the lecture exam. But for lab, you want to make sure you consult your lab instructor. When we open up the skull and we look at the inside of it on the bottom, we can see some cranial bones like the ethmoid bone, the sphenoid bone, temporal, parietal, occipital, as well as part of the frontal bone. Other parts listed here, you may or may not have to know for lab, but again, that's why you want to ask your lab instructor. On the next slide, we have a lateral view of the skull. So the cranial bones are the parietal bone, occipital, temporal, frontal, sphenoid, ethmoid, and the facial bones that are shown are the lacrimal, nasal, zygomatic bone, maxilla, as well as mandible. Some of the important structures to know, bony landmarks would be the mental foramen, the different sutures. There's 4 main sutures that you need to know. The zygomatic process, the external acoustic meatus, mastoid process, and styloid process. Going back, just so I've highlighted the important ones that I could ask you, include the sella turcica, cribriform plate, and crista galli. On this inferior view of the skull, we have the zygomatic process, palatine process, styloid process, mastoid process, and external occipital protuberance. So for lecture, I could ask you what bones those are located on. And for this one, we have the mental foramen, infraorbital foramen, supraorbital foramen, the optic canal, the middle nasal concha, and the perpendicular plate, as well as the lambdoid suture, the occipital condyle, and sagittal suture. Now, going back to the lateral view, I want you to remember the order of these bones so you can identify them for lab. So this chapter kind of helps you with lab as well, but a lot of times, as we know, there's memory tricks for A and P. So if you remember N, M, L, E, that will help you to remember the bones beginning at the very most median line. So if we separated the skull into right and left halves, we would start at the nose. So we would begin at the nasal bone. Then we would go to the maxilla bone. That would be this next bone. The third bone would be the lacrimal bone. And the fourth bone would be the ethmoid bone. So NMLE to me kind of sounds like a standardized test. But for you, hopefully it'll be a quick and easy way to remember these bones beginning in the middle and moving laterally. So again, we have the nasal bone here. The maxilla is a large bone that begins up here and continues all the way to the top of the teeth. The lacrimal bone is a small bone. And then we have part of the ethmoid bone here as well. So just a little memory trick that can be helpful to you. So this slide is going to show the facial bones, which we've already seen a few of them. And there is the mandible, 2 maxillary bones, 2 zygomatic bones, 2 nasal bones, 2 lacrimal bones, 2 palatine bones, a vomer, and an inferior nasal concha. And we'll be going through each of those individually on our next video.